one of the most interesting things about the whole idea of whiteness is that whiteness is a slippery concept. Who gets to be white changes over time. And for example, and this goes back to the Statue of Liberty, the immigrants that came into America in the first couple of decades of the 20th century, the great wave of immigration from Eastern Europe, we now look upon as white, but they were not seen as white at the time, for the most part. And that sort of changed. There's a book about Italian immigrants called White on Arrival, which suggests that these are people that once they came to America, they got to be white, although for many people, they still weren't considered white. And for many people, the Statue of Liberty was seen as an anti-immigrant symbol because these were people. There's a wonderful cartoon, for example, that shows a stereotypically looking Italian anarchist threatening the Statue of Liberty with a bomb, right? That comes from this period. So the idea that you can become white over time is one of the most fascinating things about the idea of whiteness. And it shows the idea that, okay, you can gradually earn freedom, you can become Americanized, but what it really means is you can become seen as white, and then you can be free.
Talk about the original sort of, I guess, offering of what, or that the Statue of Liberty, when the French were going to present it to the United States, they had a different vision of what it would be at first. I found this fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, it really is interesting, and it's only become widely known recently in the United States that ultimately the Statue of Liberty was intended to be a celebration of the end of slavery in the United States, and it had parallels with France as well. France in 1870, France had overthrew an empire and renewed its republican form of government, which is seen by most French people as achieving a kind of freedom. That was 5 years after the end of the Civil War and the final emancipation of the slaves. So those people who sponsored the Statue of Liberty in France felt that both countries are moving in parallel directions towards greater freedom, but that the most dramatic example of that greater freedom was the abolition of slavery in the United States. And if you look at symbols of freedom in France in earlier periods, there's a great painting from 1830 by Eugène Delacroix called Liberty Leading the People, which shows a woman that in some ways was the model for the Statue of Liberty. And yet she's a very different person. First of all, she's not standing still on a statue. She is literally leading an army, right? She is carrying a gun. She's also carrying broken chains. And she's wearing a cap. It was called the Phrygian cap, which is the Roman symbol of the freed slave. So everything in this image points to the idea of a woman as militant, but also a woman as a freed slave, basically. And those things are pretty much taken away from the Statue of Liberty. There are still broken chains at the feet of the Statue of Liberty, but unless you're in a helicopter, you'll never see them, right? And they were pretty much removed for any importance for the statue as a whole. So it's really fascinating that the greatest symbol of liberty in the United States is completely divorced from probably the greatest example of freedom in the United States, the freedom of the slaves, the freeing of the slaves in the Civil War, that these two, which they were supposed to be in a dialogue with each other, actually for the most part of the Statue of Liberty's history in America have had nothing to do with each other.
How did that come about, though? I mean, like, how conscious of a decision was that to not inflame the sensibilities of essentially white people who were having to deal with a rise in black power politically, both in terms of voting and in terms of becoming politicians, but also economically in this country? We're all talking, we're talking Reconstruction at this point, and there's obviously a tremendous amount of white backlash. How conscious of a decision was it to, like, hey, can we tone down the part about, I mean, because like who was wearing those chains at her feet? Like it's a black person wearing those chains, right? I mean, there's only one answer to that question. But she looks, I don't know, Roman, I guess, on some level.
Yeah, well, for one thing, unlike the Eugène Delacroix statue, she's fully clothed, right? She is not powerful in that kind of sense. But they came from several directions. Partly was the makers of the statue toured America in the early 1880s before the statue was brought over, and they got the sense that, yes, it needed to be toned down. There were also French reasons to tone it down. The idea that of French revolutionary women being a threat to modern liberal democracy, that was also an issue. But especially, they came in America at the end of the Reconstruction, in the post-Reconstruction era, when the destruction of multiracial democracy was complete in the United States, when blacks had largely been stripped of the right to vote, had largely been terrorized into going back into a condition that was not that much removed from slavery. And so in that context, this decision was made, okay, we need to have a more sort of abstract vision of liberty, one that emphasizes enlightenment, but one that doesn't really emphasize the bloody work it takes to free slaves, basically.
Where does the idea of liberty go from there? I mean, as we get into, when we talk about, obviously liberty becomes an issue in World War I and in World War II, but what is the evolution in terms of does it ever lose its whiteness at any given moment? And is it recovered, or is it simply just sort of like this enduring concept?
Well, no, it does. And I think, the thing about the 20th century, at least the early 20th century, is dominated by the two greatest wars the world has ever seen. And both of those wars are seen as, in many ways, wars for liberty, wars for freedom. The First World War, for example, which was also called the War to End All Wars, emphasizes the idea of freeing nations as a whole. So President Woodrow Wilson of the United States, becomes the great symbol in Europe and throughout the world of somebody saying that the end of the war should not be just victorious nations dividing up spoils and punishing the defeated, but rather enshrining certain principles about liberal democracy, about the rights of peoples to elect their own leaders, so on and so forth. And he really emphasizes these as America's gift to the world, in effect. America's vision of liberty. However, the way it transpires is that liberty is basically given to nations that are seen as white. So the Eastern European nations that are formed out of the ruins of the Austrian and German and Russian empires are given liberty. But the colonies, on the other hand, in Africa and Asia, who also come to the negotiations at the end of the war in Paris, asking for liberty, are largely given short shrift. One of the interesting things that happens, of course, is the years right after the First World War, the years when Ireland finally achieved its independence, finally shakes off several hundred years of British rule and domination, and becomes a free nation. It does so in a bloody struggle, but a successful struggle. And that struggle makes Ireland free, but it also begins to enshrine Ireland and the Irish as white in ways that they had not been during the 19th century. And then the Second World War, even more so. The Second World War, which is the greatest example of genocide in modern history, the whole anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, where you have a vision of the Jews as non-white. And as many people point out, the anti-Semitism that ultimately leads to the Holocaust borrows a lot from both American racism and European colonialism, right? And really emphasizes the Jews as a problem in Europe because they are, in effect, a non-white people within Europe that has to be expunged. Right, and is. So, but the other thing about this is that, of course, all this creates a backlash. People of color throughout the world, in the United States, in Europe, and especially in the colonial world, especially in the Second World War, there's you could fool us once, but it's hard to fool us twice, right? You can't say that this is a war for democracy and then slaughter us. And the second time around, in particular, there's a strong emphasis that we are fighting now for freedom. So if you look at the history of the civil rights movement, for example, in the United States, many of the people involved in it had been veterans of the Second World War and had come back from the Second World War like their fathers had come back from the First World War. But this time they're saying, we are not going to put up with what our fathers put up with. This time we're going to have freedom for all of us, including us, because that's what we fought and gave our lives for, and we're going to have it at home too.
And so we should say, I mean, there's two different dynamics here that are also running in parallel. One is that on a nation level, there's this fight for freedom and liberty, which is then it's almost like we're handing these cards out. Mm-hmm. And if you're not white, you don't get one of these cards. Right. And if you're not white, you end up being just sort of like a source of resources for us. Right. to maintain the liberty that we're handing, you know, for those people we're handing the cards out. And then on the personal level, there has been enough liberation or awareness or just disgust, I guess, amongst Black people who are sent to fight for the liberty of other people, and to come home to find like we don't have it here.